Good morning, everybody. I think we'll make a start. Welcome to this plenary session of the second day of the conference. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm the Director of the Institute for Policy Research here at the University of Bath, and I'm chairing this morning's plenary session. I should start by saying that Anthony Gardner, the former US Ambassador to the EU, isn't joining us this morning, isn't on this panel. However, we have an excellent panel nonetheless, and given that we don't have the former US representative, we're freer perhaps to be critical in our perspectives on the US than we might otherwise be. There's lots to talk about. The subject of our session this morning is on the transatlantic relationship, or relationships plural. It doesn't need much introduction. The news has been full in recent months and over the last couple of years on the impact of the election of Donald Trump on the relationship between the UK and the US and also the EU, tariff and trade disputes, the problematisation of the Iran deal, the move of the American embassy to East Jerusalem, querying of the commitment to NATO, the pressure put on allies over their defence spending, relationships with Russia, support for Eurosceptics, nationalist movements in the EU, etc., etc. The list is a very long one, and we hope to cover much of that today. Also, of course, in the UK, within the context of the Brexit negotiations, our security and defence relationship still being negotiated and determined with the EU in the context of Brexit, and a rise in recent years of people, particularly in the Conservative Party on the right, the Conservative Party, of the idea of an Anglosphere, that Britain's real place in the world, its natural historical place in the world, is with other English-speaking liberal so-called free market democracies in the Anglosphere, rather than as a member of the European Union, as it has been since the 70s. And of course the EU itself, with all of this going on, still dealing with the aftershocks of the refugee crisis, the rise of radical right parties, their entry into government in a number of countries, whilst also seeking to develop a new reform agenda on the Eurozone, the management and governance of the Eurozone, and also on defence and related issues. So a huge amount for us to discuss this morning. We're going to start with Mike Smith. Mike Smith, as people will know, Professor in European Politics at the University of Warwick, former chair of the UACES, co-editor of the European Union and the United States, which is being updated for a new edition, and a visiting scholar, visiting professor at a number of universities around the world. And Mike's going to speak to us first about some of the history of the transatlantic relationships and crises in them. Mike will be followed by Amelia Hadfield, who is professor at Christ Church, Canterbury University, where she founded and leads the Energy and Governance Group. Energy and the geopolitics of energy, obviously incredibly important to the issues under discussion today. And she's held various Jean Monnet chairs in recognition of her projects in Europe. And then finally, Nathalie Tocci, who is the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, honorary professor at the University of Tübingen, and her second hat is as a special advisor to Federica Mogherini. So here, as the author of the global strategy for the EU, one of the key influencers and movers on EU foreign policy today. So great to have her here today to speak to us as well. So I'm going to ask Mike to kick us off, and then that'll be followed by Amelia and Nathalie. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. And the last time I lectured to an audience like this, or this size, with a microphone in my pocket, it was a 50-minute lecture back at Loughborough. So I hope I won't actually fall into that mode on this occasion. It would be easy to, because, of course, there's quite a lot to talk about in this context. What I'm going to try and talk about is the way in which we can look at crises over the course of transatlantic relations since the 1950s. I'm going to very, very briefly look at some key dates, and then look at some of the things that I think have influenced those crises, and by implication, of course, asking the question whether the current conjuncture is different, whether it is symptomatic of some kind of step change, some kind of pending fragmentation, more fragmentation, divorce, or whatever in the transatlantic relationship. And so in a way, what I'm trying to argue is that we've seen some of this before. The question is, are we seeing something different now? This bears some resemblance, although only a very slight resemblance, to a presentation that I gave at the ISA in San Francisco earlier this year. So for those who were there, I apologize that there's some repetition, but it's more reinforcement than repetition. Okay, first thing, I want to look at some key dates, and I'm going to take about 5 minutes to deal with these. And the reason why I think they're key dates is because on the one side, they are significant to the academic study, the analysis of transatlantic relations, and on the other side, they're significant in the sense that what then followed in the practices of transatlantic relations didn't actually bear much relationship to the academic study. So I'm trying to cast some doubt on the way in which the academic identification of transatlantic relations has either followed or preceded the crises that we're talking about. 1957, publication of Karl Deutsch's et al.'s Political Community in the North Atlantic Area, which was very heavy on the growth of transactions, the growth of trust and responsiveness in the transatlantic area between the United States and Western Europe, followed by several years of discord, what Stanley Hoffman actually called discord in community, centering on Kennedy and de Gaulle and the use of the idea of the transatlantic community either as a representation of American hegemony and leadership or as a point of resistance to American hegemony and leadership. 1968, Richard Cooper published a book on the economics of interdependence, in which he famously, to me anyway, stated that because there was growing trust in the institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, because of the growth of transactions, it was a bit Deutschian in that respect, the countries of the transatlantic area were in effect integrated or become much more integrated. Again, we're talking trust, responsiveness, shared values and so on, as well as transactions. This was followed, of course, by Richard Nixon, the Nixon shock, the crises in foreign policy in which Henry Kissinger in 1973 said the Allies were acting as if the North Atlantic Alliance didn't exist, and so on. I'm not trying to sort of say there's a sort of automatic response, but I'm saying, you know, there's a way of looking at these things which compares some of the things, not all of the things that academics were saying, to what then, or was what around them was happening. 1980s, you had from Bob Cohane and Joe Nye, particularly in the late 70s, the idea of complex interdependence, the idea that the growth of multiple levels of interaction and transnational relations and transgovernmental relations created conditions in which a number of possible areas of conflict in the transatlantic area were effectively ruled out, which was followed, of course, by Ronald Reagan, the imposition of what Helmut Schmidt called the highest interest rate since the birth of Christ, the assertion by George H.W. Bush that the Americans were the leaders of the Western world and were acting like it, and of course significant resistance from both through the European community and through European member states to that particular proposition. From 1988, arbitrary choice of date, happened to be the year in which Steve Gill edited a book on transatlantic relations in which he talked about the collapse of American hegemony, European resistance, the Europeans as a point of resistance to transatlantic hegemony, and of course it chimed with a whole set of literatures in the United States itself about decline of American supremacy. By the early 1990s, people were talking about the unipolar world in which the United States was the only superpower, or hyperpuissance in the French version, and the reassertion of American hegemony in a world where it had no effective rivals. 2001, again a bit of arbitrary, Mark Pollock and Greg Schaffer published a book on the governance of transatlantic relations, transatlantic governance and the international political economy, which talked about the growing together of intergovernmental, transgovernmental and transnational relations as the basis for a dense system of governance. By the early 2000s, of course, we also had the idea that this was the new American century, that the United States would reassert itself again, and the Royal Road, of course, that led from 9/11 to the war in Iraq and what some people, Elizabeth Pond to be precise, called the near death of the Transatlantic Alliance. 2008, a year, of course, that we're all very familiar with, the beginning of a crisis in the global political economy that started in the US, spread to Western Europe and to the European Union in particular through the sovereign debt crisis, and demonstrated not only that the countries were in a sense integrated, but that contagion from the United States to Western Europe could actually, and beyond of course, could actually create grave consequences, not just in international politics, but also in domestic politics. 2016, Ricardo Alcaro and others, John Peterson and others, Ettore Greco, published a book on the West and the global power shift, and the idea that the scenery had moved around transatlantic relations and that transatlantic relations needed to respond to that change in scenery, or in a sense to become much less central to it. So there's a challenge of global power shifts and the need to take responsibility in a new kind of international politics, but of course that's been followed by, in the United States at least, but also in some European countries, by determination to actually withdraw or go back to an earlier period or try and restore a sort of isolationist or insular type of politics. So this was described in actually the early 1980s by Henry Now as domesticism, the idea that you put the domestic economy and domestic politics first, particularly in the United States, and that when that is remedied through whatever means, you get a demonstration effect which will then spread to the rest of the world. Now, I'm not sure that the demonstration effect of Trumpism is one that we would want necessarily to spread to the rest of the world, but you can see his point. Okay, so that's a very, very brief tour of some of the literature and some of the crises. There are a number of key elements in this. The first is contestation. I'm putting forward the argument that contestation and potential crisis are a continuous thread in EC and EU-US relations and broader transatlantic relations. I'm not going to say very much about NATO, but of course we can come to that in discussion, but it has some of the implications for NATO as it does for the EC and the EU. This relates to some of the central characteristics of what in the book that Nick referred to earlier on, we talked about as the Euro-American system. The role of power, the role of markets, the role of social and ideational forces, and the role of institutions. And the key thing is that when we see challenges and crises within the transatlantic relationships, they're challenges to one or more of these elements of the relationship. They're challenges either in terms of power, in terms of the development of markets, in terms of cultural factors that you might describe them as, ideational factors, and in terms of institutions. And of course, they can be challenges to all four at once. Another feature of this is the growth and the scope and the depth of the Euro-American system, which I've talked about in a sense indirectly already, and its openness to broader global trends. So this is a very complex system, a dense system, if you like, the one that actually people have talked about as being heavily integrated, but it's also one which is very open to forces from the rest of the global arena. It's also open to forces from domestic sources, from domestic political, economic, and institutional arrangements. So the idea is that if you get contestation and you get a super crisis in this relationship, it's a challenge not only emanating from the global system as a whole, but from domestic politics and expressed in terms of power, markets, ideas, and institutions. I'm simply putting that before you, and you can reflect yourselves on the extent to which those crises that I talked about just now fitted into this particular pattern. And of course, we need to reflect on the extent to which the current crisis fits into that pattern. And that brings you to questions about crisis and contestation. are we talking about something that's structural, that really has proceeded and reflects structural changes, both in the transatlantic relationship and outside it? Or is it cyclical? It just comes round once every 10 years. And if you look at the pattern, it comes round pretty much once every 10 years. Strangely enough, it also comes around with Republican administrations in the United States. That doesn't mean that Democratic administrations have been devoid of contestation. It just means that things that are being called crises tend to have occurred in Republican periods. This raises questions which you can pursue elsewhere or at greater length another time about logics of consequences and appropriateness. Is the Euro-American system a site for competition and bargaining, and therefore the crises are crises about how you bargain, about how you come into conflict over material issues? Or is it a process of social learning and responsiveness? And you can see from what I said about those earlier crises that we've got both those elements. You've got the exertion of power or shifts in power, but you've also got this notion that in some way we're talking about countries and societies that are responsive to each other and therefore, in a sense, more socially integrated and culturally integrated. The current crisis, of course, can be seen as all of those things to the nth degree. I would say that it's domesticism, the focus on America first particularly, run riot. But don't forget that there's also a domesticism in the EU, a domesticism encouraged by the aftermath of financial and economic crisis, by the spread of radical right movements and so on, and by populism in European societies, and the obsession with dealing with the consequences of mobility and dealing with the consequences of things such as migration. Therefore, the crisis is not simply one of domesticism, because this gets transmitted across international boundaries and continental boundaries. It reflects in part what some people have called transnational nationalism, the simultaneous eruption of populist movements in large numbers of areas. Or some people, if you're an incurable optimist and a glass half full person, would say, can we discern the beginnings of some sort of new settlement in transatlantic relations based on things like the greater strategic autonomy, to use words from the global strategy of the EU, and so on. So the future, people have been doing this for ages, this kind of projection of transatlantic relations in the future. Some people might say that one solution is a kind of devolution. That was tried to a certain extent under the Obama administration. That's long forgotten, in a sense. Is it one of pluralism? Going right back to Karl Deutsch and his co-authors, they talked about pluralistic security communities and the way in which they might work. Is it one of fragmentation, or is it one of chaos? Chaos created not simply by the politics in the United States and the EU, but also by the impact of uncertainties from the outside world and the effects of power shifts in the broader global arena. Implications. This is a bit academic, but you can't understand this crisis or other crises in transatlantic relations without a multidimensional approach. You've got to understand, in this context, contestation and crises as disruptions of those key elements that I talked about earlier on. They also reflect broader contextual factors, what you might describe as contingent factors that cause disruption, and the scope, intensity, and what I would call the contagion of disruptive factors from domestic forces or from broader international forces. So what I've proposed to you is the idea that periods of contestation and crisis are just built into the transatlantic relationship, that they have been part of an extended historical process, and that people have declared critical junctures on a regular basis in transatlantic relations, need to keep them in perspective, but to be aware of the changing context and the changing implications of what we might describe as contingent factors. That's my pitch.
Thank you very much, Mike. If you let me come down, I'll just... that's it, yeah, well done. Great. Okay, well, Amelia is our next speaker. If you hold your questions and thoughts, we'll come back to it in discussion at the end. Amelia is our next speaker. I'm just going to come in between you here, if I may.
Is that to keep an eye on me, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm keeping you to time. Over to you, Amelia.
Thank you. Well, a huge thanks to UACES for the opportunity. It's a tremendous privilege to speak at the plenary, and I think Mike's done all the hard work, so thanks for that. I speak to you today, therefore, on Trump and transatlantic relations and a few other fun things like Brexit, as a Brit, as a Canadian, as an educator and an analyst and a woman and a human being. I think that covers it. I don't really want to begin with the litany of idiocy that we've seen from Trump, but I'm going to. Without a doubt, I think the presidency has certainly, in emotive terms, it's supercharged extreme right-wing forces across the continent by supporting and worryingly normalizing political positions long considered unacceptable in democratic societies. His vocal attacks on human rights, on legal norms, social welfare, and his cynical demonization of migrants and Muslims, and in general people of color, has given permission, it's a permissive discourse, for ultra-nationalist governments to undermine constitutional safeguards and to pursue very public forms of discrimination. And this has happened in the United States, and it's happening in Europe too. It's not simply going to be the US and Trump sitting on the naughty step. Examples include Hungary's proposal to criminalize aid to migrants, Italy's ominous registration of Roma and the Sinti people, and Poland's purge of Supreme Court judges. Most pervasively, Trump's denial of evidence, and this is what should worry us as scholars. Denial of empirical evidence, alternative facts, call it what you will, and his open and repeated recourse to racism, personal insults, and the sort of sneering, crushing method by which he puts his opinions forward have helped to export the corrosion of public discourse that has been a growing feature of American political life. And worse, he's upset the Canadians, and that's just not on. My argument is that Trump is creating short-term damage to the liberal world order, and much worse, long-term destruction to Western political discourse. I'd like to look at those briefly, and then if I can, try to suggest ways forward, and Nathalie will assist in terms of the European perspective. In terms of the short-term damage, I guess the good news is that Trump appears to be wrecking the Western liberal order. That's the good news. Yeah, you can laugh, that's fine. He's doing the Kremlin's work by sowing discord in the West, and some good examples, of course, very well known. He's called into question the modus operandi of collective security at NATO, international trade bodies like the WTO, interlocking institutions and power pooling like the European Union, and international trade agreements themselves like TTIP and NAFTA. Why? Why has he done this? Because, of course, according to him, these institutions make America look like a patsy, like a loser, a big loser. Having failed to win anything, including the popular vote, Trump has made a winning strategy out of portraying America as a colossal global loser, hence the need to make America great again. It's classic victim philosophy. More good news? I think the order itself is probably pretty sustainable, at least in terms of its institutional structures. It's pretty sticky. I think we've seen attacks on its keystones, but I'm not sure if this is quite the same as a sort of wholesale interinstitutional unraveling. There is damage, to be sure, and I'll look at this. I'd like to quote Stuart Patrick, who says that in the past 18 months, Trump has torn at the roots and hacked at the branches of Western multilateral solidarity that his predecessors painstakingly cultivated over 7 decades. At the same time, we might be prematurely mourning the downfall of the liberal international order. Not to worry, I think it's fixable now, and he won't be around forever. As Terry suggested last night, he's a quirk. So however despotic his inclinations, Trump's ability to wreck the outer walls of Western order, I think hinges upon the degree to which he can translate, as Mike said, his domestic, the nationalistic zero-sum worldview into actions on the world state. And for those of us studying foreign policy, that's really what counts. And he has to do so in a way that will outlive him in institutional terms. So the bad news is that the threat isn't exactly the Trumpian wrecking ball. It's the insidious virus, I think, that is being spread beneath. It's the fact that the quirk is wreaking profound destruction in a much more insidious way. He's creating long-term damage to Western norms and values. And the longer he goes unchecked, the more it encourages other powers, and you know who I'm talking about, to act with impunity, and us to react with apathy. As I've suggested, much of Trump's attitude is predicated on sort of national rehabilitation, attempting changes that play very well to his domestic base, regardless of the international shock and outrage, and the domestic shock and outrage within the United States as well. And this is premised on a zero-sum approach. More for me is less for you. That's fine, because we don't like how you do things anyhow. If, according to Trump, America is a loser in multilateral trade and normative terms, then it is not only someone else's fault, probably those pesky Europeans who are insisting on buying their own cars. It's not just a question of unfair structures, like the EU and NATO and the WTO or FTAs in general. It's the bad ideas on which Trump assumes they're based to begin with. And bad ideas for him include basic values like cooperation, consensus, compromise, trust, solidarity. These are generally regarded by Trump as a total waste of time, archaic at best, and at worst a hindrance to the art of the deal. Instead, Trump favors division, not unity, divide et imperium, lambasting Germany for being a Russian patsy, and Prime Minister May for even dealing with the European Union, China for selling steel, the EU for everything. He's also lambasting advanced norms, not just basic values, human rights, rule of law. Now, these are routinely ignored in Russia, China, Turkey, and North Korea, and yet he has no problem dealing, for the most part, with these states. On collective defense, for the most part, as we've seen with NATO, he's entirely focused on money, not protecting the shared values of deterrence or the need to project security by deepening solidarity in an alliance the US itself helped to found. So Trump's preferred political discourse seems to be ideologues and populism, as we know. He has only praise for populist leaders like those in Hungary and Poland because, in his view, they successfully weaken European solidarity and conform neatly to his anti-immigrant views. He also likes what I like to think of as sort of optic summits, dictator shopping, if you like. I suspect that's why meeting non-democratic leaders is so much easier for Trump, because the scripts, if there are any, are norm-free. They present instead a sort of tete-a-tete within a value vacuum where only strongmen identities prevail, and the space for competition without rules is wide open. I think we still stand aghast at the Helsinki paint-by-numbers summit. And also the sort of black and white literalism, the winners and losers, a sort of Manichean approach to foreign policy, friends and competitors. Germany, for example, seems to be a winning competitor because it makes good cars that Americans like to buy, unfortunately, runs a trade surplus, is a European anchor, but again, it's a loser because it allows itself to be suckered by a bigger winner, Russia, at least in terms of energy security, and its free-riding attitude to European defense. That's Trump, not me. Trump and Brexit's best example of sort of coming together. How do we pull together these discourses? The connective tissue, I think, was the protest of July 2018, just recently, the sort of Polly protest, when his non-official state visit reflected the intense Brexit turmoil over the Chequers proposal, as you remember, but at the same time proved to be a tremendous unifying force. We'll no doubt remember protests across Britain itself drew tens of thousands in many cities. In London, and I'm proud to say I walked among them, it numbered 250,000, which was the largest UK protest since the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, at first blush, the protest was most obviously an anti-Trump backlash in defense of democratic norms, but I think a closer look illustrates that it was a sort of polymorphous protest, with demonstrators expressing very wide-range concerns over the future of the Supreme Court and judicial appointments, abortion rights, the treatment of migrants globally, the political exploitation of xenophobia and racism, the fate of Palestine after the relocation of the US Embassy to Jerusalem, and Trump's own personal sexist, homophobic, transphobic rhetoric, and the prospect of tactical nuclear weapons becoming a routine military tool. Most striking, I think, for both anti-Trump and indeed anti-Brexit narratives in the protest was the refusal in general to see the source of these dangers as simply foreign or wrong or daft or loser-like. And this is the key. The refusal to project political blame simply outside our polity. Quite the reverse. It's not simply that the tone of the demonstration was resolutely not anti-American, but that in the placards and banners and conversations and interviews and the speeches at the final rally, the march connected the political phenomenon represented by Trump with similar forces in Britain and Europe. Either that's a good thing, or the virus has spread. From a scholarly perspective, I think, it struck me that rather than promoting a kind of self-satisfied disgust at the faults of others, Trump's visit here to Britain provided a powerful lens for interrogating the current state of British and European politics. And this suggests, as I suggested at the beginning, there are others that are culpable. I think to some degree some of us are still on the naughty step. The Trump administration's deliberate policy of separating and traumatizing migrant children and families has shocked everyone across the world. And it served for the London marchers as a prism to view Britain's own treatment of migrants, European, Caribbean, and further afield. The British government has denied the citizenship of legal migrants from the Caribbean and contributed to increasing the racial discrimination and intolerance with its cavalier attitude to the rights of EU citizens in the UK and its reckless attitude to the withdrawal of EU rights from British citizens as co-citizens of the EU. And beyond the EU, this year in particular, I think, has seen the slow exposure of a toxic regime that erodes the human rights of us all, including migrants and asylum seekers, a program described bureaucratically as creating a hostile environment. Now, the UK's hostile environment for migrants hasn't, of course, reached the same levels of human rights abuse as the operation of ICE in the US Border Patrol. But the comparison is an important part of the dynamics of resistance generated by the transatlantic Trump effect. Explicit abuses in states like America and Britain that openly deny the human rights of others points to an equivalent moral failure in European polities and the EU as a whole, which now are dangerously close to paying lip service to the rhetoric of human rights while increasingly permitting the violation of human rights norms. I must, at this stage as a Canadian, register my astonishment that a long-standing partner like Canada is maligned and sanctioned for daring to stand up to Saudi Arabia over historic human rights abuses, illegal imprisonment, and the public punishment of a Saudi Canadian citizen, and that there was barely a flicker on the international stage to support Canada. In conclusion, how do we prepare for a post-Trump, post-Brexit world? Mike very clearly and correctly said that contestation is a continuous thread. As regions, we need to fight back against the threat of a value vacuum. We can certainly forge trades and political dialogue with like-minded nations, but we must, in doing so, go beyond the lip service of global governance to make practical improvements to the international rule-based system, enhanced security, accountability, transparency, enforceability. And we need to wake up. We need to acknowledge that neoliberal multilateralism and even globalization isn't an automatic home run or even necessarily understood clearly by all. We need to accept that the benefits of shared sovereignty and common standards result for many in disempowered modes of traditional decision-making, including areas like legislatures, trade unions, and electorates. We need to redress the sense of alienation, the lack of accountability, the sense of individual and communal disenfranchisement, which to many looks like de-democratization. And we need to think swiftly about how to make projects work on the basis of re-democratization, especially after Trump. Failing to do so, we'll simply yield more Trumps, more heads of state who point to legitimately held fears about perceived threats to local and national identities associated with migration and population movements, as Mike mentioned before, using a powerful narrative of loss, victimization, and vicious redress. Inane mantras like "Make America Great Again" are uneasily close to Brexit's "Get Back Control" mantra. All it takes is one or two individuals to tap the emotional unpredictability of political discontent, right or left, couple it with local disenchantment, add a soupçon of ideological recklessness, and you have a president like Trump, or an electorate that votes to leave the EU, turning its back on a shared heritage, or a country that starts nailing up chicken wire on its borders, or locking up children, and simply allows any kind of other system, organization, idea to be seen as wrong, bad, and the object of bombast and xenophobia. That's the point. The Western multilateral structures can probably absorb the slings and arrows of an outraged Trump, but now the ideas themselves are at stake. There was a wonderful piece in the Financial Times interviewing Kissinger a few weeks ago. He's not everybody's cup of tea, but he's still something of a Delphic oracle in foreign policy terms. And the interview tried his damnedest to get Kissinger to confess his frank opinion on Trump, knowing that he briefed Trump. And finally, the following Q&A transpired, which I'll just read to you. Question: do you believe there is a non-trivial chance that Trump could accidentally scare us into reinventing the rules-based order that we used to take for granted? Kissinger: I think Trump may be one of those figures in history who appears from time to time to mark the end of an era and to force it to give up its old pretenses. Nathalie is going to talk to you about how that's going to work in Europe. As security providers, I think perhaps we need to drop our illusions about America permanently underwriting NATO. The transatlantic bond may not be immutable. We certainly need to construct a European plan B. As scholars, I think we need to think very clearly and try to get beyond the unfortunate consequence of Trump's cavalier, corrupt, and capricious handling of foreign policy. For a nice shopping list, do read Stephen Walt's idea of how to remake foreign policy, thinking about cybersecurity, new institutions for a world economy, etc. Those of you who know me know that I adore Shakespeare, so I will give you my three-way suggestion of how things can wrap up in the world. The best outcome, I think, is maybe that of King Lear, the mad king surrounded by craven criminals, who finally abdicates in favor of his wiser, incorruptible daughter Cordelia, and everything returns to normal. The middling outcome, I think, is Hamlet, sort of short-term madness and homicide, but it's largely contained within one family. And he's ultimately bailed out over the long term by a bigger, wiser, reformist neighbor. And the worst outcome, I think, is probably Troilus and Cressida. Everybody winds up dead, and you wish you'd gone to see the importance of being earnest instead. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amelia, leaving us with that Shakespearean tragedy from which we hope Europe can extricate us. Perhaps, Nathalie, we pivoted in her remarks there, Amelia pivoted across to the European response. Perhaps you could pick it up there.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Is this working? Yes, I think it is. Well, I think sort of, what we've heard so far are two apparently different, but actually not contradicting and contrasting stories. I think what we've heard from Mike was basically a story of, the sort of cyclical nature of the crises in the transatlantic relationship. And I think he's absolutely right. I think what we've been hearing from Amelia is, hang on, there is actually something unprecedented here. And what's unprecedented here has actually to do internally with the United States and its role in the world. And the argument that I'll try to develop in the few minutes ahead of us is really that of saying, well, indeed, perhaps so far when it comes to the transatlantic relationship, this is not an unprecedented crisis. But when it comes to the structure of the United States in the world, then there is actually something unprecedented there. And it didn't necessarily begin with Trump, and it will not necessarily end with Trump, but there is a structural change going on And that structural change that has to do with the US's role in the world will have to have an unprecedented structural effect, therefore, on the transatlantic relationship, if that transatlantic relationship is to survive in the 21st century. And just let me run you through the steps of the argument here. Now, I think sort of, picking up from Mike's argument, it's true that there is a tendency to sort of view the past in transatlantic ties with rose-tinted lenses. And indeed, it is true that this is a bond which has been unprecedented in security terms, obviously largely through NATO, unprecedented in economic terms, growingly through the US-EU relationship, and unprecedented in political terms, largely through the bilateral relationship between the United States and the member states. I mean, the United States never took the EU as such as a particularly credible political interlocutor. And if one puts all of these elements together, and of course many more could be added, I think it's fair to say that this is and has been, for the best part of the last century, the broadest and deepest sort of international relationship on the planet. Now, I think precisely because the social, cultural, ideational, economic, political, security, etc., depth and breadth of the relationship has been so wide, it's inevitable that those tensions and those crises existed. If the opportunities for contact were less, then we wouldn't even be talking about frictions and tensions in the relationship. And indeed, one only needs to sort of cast one's mind back to banana wars or freedom fries to look at two different policy areas to sort of recall how acute some of those tensions and frictions were. But indeed, and here I'm with Michael, arguably all these tensions took place within a structure of the relationship which essentially remained unchanged up until now. And that structure of the relationship really had to do, in my mind, more with the role of the United States in the world than with the bilateral relationship between Europe and the United States. And what I mean by this is a relationship which unfolded firstly in a broader structural context in which the United States was the hegemonic force of the quote-unquote free world during the Cold War and of the world tout court since then. Now, having said all this, I think there is a structural change going on which has to do with the US's role in the world today. And as I said, by today I don't mean today Trump, I mean this historical period that we're living through. And indeed, in many respects, one can look at Trump as being a symptom of this, a particularly acute symptom of this, but he is a symptom of a structural change of the United States' role in the world. And the way in which I would depict that structural change is that I think we're moving into a world, into a post-US imperial world. Now, arguably, one could say that actually Trump is not the first post-imperial president of the United States, he's the second. Obama was the first post-imperial president of the United States. And by post-imperial, what I mean is a president that recognizes that the United States cannot be the sole organizer, manager, and rule maker of a system which is broader than itself. Now, Obama recognized this, and this is, of course, a story, again, it's a structural story. It's a story about the way in which power is shifting and west to east, the way in which power is diffusing beyond the boundaries of the nation state, the way in which power no longer simply resides within particular actors but flows between them through sort of networks and webs and nodes. So this structural transformation of power necessarily implies that the United States can no longer have the role that it once did. As I said, I think Obama, as the first post-imperial president of the United States, recognized this, recognized the fact that the United States could no longer be the global policeman. But unlike Trump, Trump was very attached to that system. Let's call it the international liberal order. And therefore, in order To preserve that system, he knew that what the United States had to do was to redistribute responsibilities to others. If one looks at slogans like leading from behind, if one looks at initiatives like the JCPOA, what was the JCPOA all about? It was not simply about preventing the Iranian nuclear program for allowing Iran to developing the nuclear bomb. It was about trying to lead to a system in which the Middle East itself would see its internal balance of power, which would no longer require that global policeman to call all the shots. So this was what Obama was all about, an attachment to the system, a recognition that the United States can no longer be the sole manager of that system, and therefore an attempt at redistributing responsibilities to others. Now, Trump, of course, is a president, a post-imperial president of a completely different nature. Trump also recognizes that the United States cannot run the system. But the truth is that Trump doesn't give a damn about that system. Now, Trump still knows that today, and not necessarily tomorrow, the United States is still the strongest kid on the block. And so he knows that the United States can extract as much benefit from that system. And the truth is that if, in order to extract as much benefit to the system, the price to pay is wrecking the system altogether, Trump doesn't care. So in this respect, he is fundamentally different from Obama, although the starting, the sort of premises of all this are probably quite similar. Now, if one thinks about the whole story, indeed, about the JCPOA, about the effect of secondary sanctions, the way, for instance, the Europeans have been reacting, for example, by putting in place the blocking regulation. Now, what's interesting about this, because I think it relates to this story about the attitude of the United States towards the system, is that the blocking statute is not a new statute. It was first enacted back in the 1990s, and again in response to US secondary sanctions, in this case, vis-a-vis Cuba, Libya, and Iran itself. But unlike the situation back then, in which that blocking statute was put in place, in practice it was never really enacted because there was no need to enact it, because back then, Clinton administration was attached to that system and therefore wanted to resolve that dispute through the WTO as we did back then in the 1990s. Today, not only are we in a situation in which those secondary sanctions are going to be implemented, but we're in a situation in which Trump is quite happy to pull out of the WTO altogether. So we are in a fundamentally different situation because the attitude of the United States vis-a-vis a system which is broader than itself has fundamentally changed. So, moving on to the European implications of all of this. What do we do? What should we do? So if it is true that we are not yet in a situation in which we have structurally changed the nature of the relationship, my argument is that because there is a structural change in the United States' role in the world, we necessarily have to change the structural nature of the transatlantic relationship if we want that relationship to survive in the 21st century. And this basically requires work, largely, I would say, on the European side. This is not a US responsibility at all. I mean, the US can make it harder or easier, but the work has to be done by Europeans themselves. And what does that work actually entail? Well, it's basically all about growing up. It's basically all about pulling up one's sleeves. This obviously is a big story about security and defense. It's not, by the way, an exclusive story about security and defense. And one begins to see, I'll come back to security and defense in a minute, but just to give a sense of how this is actually a much wider story, what I thought was very interesting was the article that German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas put out. I think it was an op-ed a couple of weeks ago, not more, basically hinting at the desirability of an alternative system to SWIFT as a means of circumventing the effect of US secondary sanctions. Now, we're still a million light years away from a situation like this, and indeed Heiko Maas was immediately rebuked by Chancellor Merkel. But the point is that the genie's out of the bottle. The debate has started now about how can Europeans basically become more autonomous in the economic sphere, but then obviously here the big challenge really has to do with security and defense, because indeed, let's face it, Europeans, since the end of World War II, have basically outsourced their security to the United States. Now, Are we beginning to see the beginning of this growing up? I would say that yes, that beginning is there. It's probably far too slow. But again, I think including on security and defense, the genie's out of the bottle. If one looks at the kind of steps that have been taken over the last couple of years, initiatives such as PESCO, the NPCC that cannot be called a headquarter, but basically that's what the idea is, the European Defence Fund, for the first time in history, the European Commission that no longer considers defence a dirty word, but actually puts money into it. All of these things, I wouldn't put the argument of saying they have happened because of Trump, but certainly Trump and Brexit and a number of other factors have been instrumental in triggering these changes. And let me just give you one small anecdote about the Trump effect on all of this. I remember very well negotiations in the Political and Security Committee in November of 2016. And the beginning of that week, negotiations started in PSC in order obviously to sort of prepare conclusions for the Foreign Affairs Council, which was a jumbo, a Foreign Affairs Defence Council, that month that would have approved the so-called implementation plan on security and defence from the EU Global Strategy. And that was basically the plan that listed the set of task aims, which included PESCO, and they included the NPCC, and they included a number of things which then happened after that plan was approved. Now, frankly speaking, those negotiations were really going very badly at the beginning of, end of October, beginning of November. And I was dead sure that there would not have been an agreement on them. And always there at the back of a number of member states' mind, I mean, some were concerned about money and spending and others were basically concerned about the old story of NATO and no duplication, the 3Ds back in the 1990s. And as I said, those negotiations were not going badly. Then we reconvene on the, I remember it was the Monday, on the Tuesday, following the US election. And the mood had just so palpably changed. Now and then there would be someone saying, NATO, and I would look at them saying, come again, say that again. And in 2.5 days, the text, unaltered, was accepted by all 28, including the United Kingdom, member states. Now, as I said, I don't want to argue here and exaggerate the argument saying this was all because of Trump, but I think it's fair to say that this has been a fundamental factor in all of this. So as I said, the change, I think, has started. It's far too slow. If Trump tomorrow were to say, well, we pull out of NATO, we no longer underwrite European security, we'd be screwed. And that change is going to take the best part of 20 to 30 years to take place, if it does take place. But let me also say that the most difficult step to take in this, let's say, emancipation of the Europeans is a psychological step. It's not only about the money and the this and the that and the other, it's psychological. I mean, I've been really struck the number of times in which I get, sort of Arabs and Iranians and Africans from all over the place coming up to me, particularly in reference to the whole JCPOA story and how can Europeans, stand up more to the Americans, of looking at, just coming to me and sort of looking at me and saying, what's the problem with you guys? You guys are rich. You're amongst the strongest sort of powers in the world, everything notwithstanding. Why is it that you cannot do what others seem to have no issue in doing, And the problem is psychological. It's taking that psychological step of basically saying, hey, actually we can have a different idea and we can follow up on that different idea through different action. But it's a psychological step which we're still not quite there yet, which is why I agree with Michael in saying there is not yet a structural change in the relationship. But there will have to be because of the structural shift in the US role in the world. So, in conclusion, my bottom line really is that of saying that if there is to be a healthy transatlantic relationship in the 21st century, there will necessarily have to be that structural shift, and that structural shift is going to be a slow and painful one. I associate it a bit to that very difficult period in the relationship between a parent and a child, which is adolescence. In that period of life, you know, the child moves from being a child to being an adult, and it's normally a period full of tensions and crises in the family. And in order for that to work, ultimately, I think two magic words are necessary. Magic word number one is responsibility, meaning the child has to, in order to be treated as an adult, has to acquire greater responsibility, and this is obviously task number one for the Europeans. And then the second magic word is another R word, which is respect. So the adult has to respect that the child is no longer a child, and he's an adult that has to be treated on a par. And I think if those two magic words will somehow materialize, I don't have a lot of confidence about the next couple of years with Trump, but indeed, you know, presidents come and go. They may make lasting damage, but they do ultimately come and go. But I do remain confident in the long term, meaning the next 20, 30, 40 years, that those two magic words will actually be enacted over time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Nathalie. So we have just under half an hour for discussion and debate. We have some roving mics. I think we've got some colleagues are going to come down and pick the mics up so we can come and bring the mics to you. If you raise your hand and if you could just say who you are, and if you're addressing a question to a particular member of the panel, also do let us know. So first one over here, if we could. Thanks very much, gentleman in the red scarf.
Thank you very much. Pierre Roche, Institute for Strategic Research in Paris. I have a general question. We have heard that Trump is damaging the transatlantic relations, but on the other hand, that the Trump effect can be an opportunity. And I work on security and defense, and it's true that I've met so many officials in Brussels and national capitals saying that the Trump effect was a good opportunity for them also. So is it possible to argue that actually by putting provocative word on this changing structural, on these structural changes, it's actually is actually improving in a way the transatlantic relations, because it's forcing European leaders to look at this reality and not to ignore it as they have done in the past. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much. Could you take a couple more? We'll come down here next. Yeah.
Emil Kirchner, University of Essex. Thank you very much for the presentations. NATO was sort of slightly mentioned by Michael, Nathalie not at all. I was wondering, Nathalie particularly, what role is NATO to play in the future, and if any at all? Thank you.
Very good question. Should we take one more? Have we got one more? Yeah, gentleman here. Yeah.
I'm Geoffrey Harris. I'm a former official of the European Parliament. Just two questions. I think, one observation, I think Terry yesterday said Trump might be a quirk, because I was looking for this, whether he is, obviously we would hope that he is, but she was talking about the midterm elections, and anybody who observed the rise of Trump, I was living in the US at the time, would know that he was written off every single day of the week for about a year and a half, yeah, even though he was dominating the media exactly as he does now. But anyway, two questions. Michael, you've written a lot about our crisis of multilateralism. Isn't there a difference today in terms of the transatlantic relationship, in that there is a very big other on the global stage, namely China? 10, 20, 30 years ago, one could ignore China. Maybe Henry Kissinger, who was mentioned, didn't, but there you go. The other, so isn't that really a structural global change, which both EU and US have to try and come to terms with, and have difficulty by definition in doing so? The other thing, Nathalie, excellent, very good, but you didn't mention your own country. Because in the context of transatlantic Trumpism, you have Mr. Salvini who makes speeches, his body language language pointing at the media and things like that, let alone the hostility towards refugees, is virtually the same as Trump and is apparently equally successful. Doesn't that possibly undermine your optimism about the successful initiatives that you've been involved with?
Okay, thanks very much indeed. We'll come back and do another round of questions. But Mike, can I start with you, perhaps picking up those points directly? China and Salvini.
Well, the China one, I defer to others on the Italian situation. But on the China one, I was just thinking, I'm not solely rooted in the past, but I do remember an article by Emanuel Wallerstein back in the 1980s in Foreign Policy magazine entitled Friends as Foes, in which he talked about the possibility of structural change, and Wallerstein is a core periphery analyst in general, and talked about the possibility of, I think it was in his case, the EC, EU, and Russia lining up against the US and China. And this kind of big picture structural thinking is something that's really quite important at the minute. I mean, it may be expressed in very parochial terms in some instances, but I think you're right that the not just the emergence, but the assertiveness of China, as exemplified by Xi Jinping's speeches. You know, we don't know what's going to happen to Xi Jinping in this future, of course, but is something that fundamentally changes the calculus, if you want to use those terms, those kind of geopolitical terms, and it does create a situation. It goes back to the point about whether this is an opportunity for the Europeans or just simply a threat. It does create new opportunities. The point is, and I've made this in a few things that I've written, that as the EU takes opportunities, it also incurs risk and potential cost. And that's one of the things that the leaders in the EU need to take on board, the notion of risk. And the EU has traditionally been very risk averse, of course. But the question of risk and building that into your calculation of how you should do. And in effect also whether the EU can ever really do geopolitics in the sense that we like to imagine that national states can. So I think it poses a huge problem. I mean, it's not just a political or a security problem, it's an economic issue as well. And the EU's relationship with China economically is difficult, but not as difficult as Trump has made the US relationship with China. So I think I agree with your point, basically. Don't want to go on anymore.
Nathalie, can you pick up the point on NATO perhaps first?
So I think the starting point of the reflection here is, particularly when we're talking about security and defence, is not to talk about the EU, full stop, but to talk about the fact that Europeans need to assume greater responsibility. Now, I think today asking the question, and therefore should it be done in a NATO context or in an EU context, is not important, meaning it has to be done in both, because actually they can do different things. And let me just give one example as to why developments over the last couple of years have proved completely wrong the paranoia that existed back in the 1990s with Madeleine Albright's 3Ds and what have you, which is military mobility. I mean, this has been, as NATO's forward presence in the East has been bolstered, the problem of military mobility has really emerged as a key issue within NATO. It's all very well and good to have forces in the Baltic countries and Poland, but if they actually cannot move around from one country to the other, they're not that very rapid in their potential response to a threat. Now, if you do want to move forward on military mobility, actually there's nothing NATO can do, because this is about building roads and bridges. It's both about the hard infrastructure and about the soft infrastructure. And of course, this is an EU thing to do, and it's not a coincidence that military mobility has been one of the flagship projects, in fact, the most advanced at this stage, within PESCO. Now, so I think now we're in this fudgy period in between. Now, I think there is a legitimate question to ask, but the answer is to be found in the United States and not in Europe, of basically saying, well, moving forward, if the US is to gradually, Trump or no Trump, decrease its commitment to NATO, because it will simply not have the same interest that it once did in European security, because its big strategic challenge is China, and because it will have relatively less capability of addressing everything in the world. It goes back to, the US as becoming a sort of post-imperial power. Now, at that point in time, I think it will be a legitimate question for Europeans to ask themselves, and therefore should we continue to be doing all this within NATO, because actually the role of Canada and Turkey and Norway is still important enough, or should we be doing this within an exclusive EU context, building ties with these other powers? I think that question will emerge. It's not today's question, but I think it will be tomorrow's question. Very briefly on the other two questions. I think on this issue of, Trump, is he an opportunity or is he a threat? I think my sort of one-sentence answer to it is he's an opportunity to the extent that he doesn't actually act upon the threat today. Meaning, if today, the US were to pull out of NATO, we would be in huge trouble, because I said, even in the best of circumstances, it's going to take 2 or 3 decades to do what is necessary to actually become strategically autonomous. But probably the question mark concerning the reliability of the United States in protecting European security is necessary in order to gradually wake up Europeans into acquiring the responsibility that they need to take. Final sort of answer concerning the optimism, and if I can put it, beyond Salvini or Trump, if I can put it more broadly, I think the million-dollar question is that of saying, beyond what we say about the rest of the world and the bilateral transatlantic relationship, are we actually going to remain internally like-minded? And this is the story about values. And if we're not, meaning if the kind of values that are going to consolidate within Europe are values that run contrary to everything which the European Union is, and indeed the transatlantic relationship is, then are we not in a difficult place? And just to sort of give you another small anecdote that comes actually this time from 3-4 days ago at the Gymnich in Vienna. I had to speak at a lunch for some really weird reason, I know nothing about this, about the impact of the digital revolution on democracy. And this was an informal foreign ministers' lunch, and it was together with the 6 Balkan countries plus Turkey. And I was sitting next to the Hungarian foreign minister and the Italian foreign minister. And the sort of notes that I'd scribbled on the plane flying up to Vienna were basically again, slightly simplifying here, was, the way in which populists have been far more effective in using digitalization, et cetera, et cetera. And while I was speaking, I kept on talking about us, and them being the sort of nationalist populists, and us being the like-minded. And as I was talking, I was like, how on earth are these people sitting next to me to my left and right going to be taking all this, Because indeed, you start having these conversations, and what was once obvious only a few years ago is so not obvious anymore. So I think this is indeed the million-dollar. I think, if we are to sort of gradually move into this world of greater responsibility and greater respect, obviously this does require that somehow we manage to sort of latch on to those values in one way or another. Now, whether we're going to manage to do it, who knows? What I do, though, know is that I think the logic, particularly when it comes to the European Union, the logic of the European Union in the 21st century is not the logic of, peace on the continent after the end of the world, war. It's not the logic of the luxury of visa-free travel and Interrail when we were teenagers, or free roaming. It's the logic of basically saying we can love it or hate it, depending on where we are politically speaking, but we need it.
Thank you, Nathalie. Amelia, perhaps I can ask you to respond as well.
Well, I mean, Nathalie sort of touched on the majority of it. Just in terms of damage and opportunity, I think if there is going to be genuine change, genuine opportunity, the sense of a change, the sense of the need for the change really has to be rooted in the time before Trump. Otherwise, I think we run the risk of mapping and sort of telescoping onto Trump, and in a sense, sort of legitimating him as a catalyst. And I don't really think I want to do that, frankly. I don't think I want to crystallize his ideas and go, oh, thank God for him. He was a total pain in the arse, but look at NATO now. I think the best method, the best modus operandi, obviously, exactly as Nathalie said, you don't have to wait for the damage to be done to move on the opportunity. At the same time, I think you're quite right. It is a psychological change that does require a shift, and the psychological change is risk averse, as Michael said. So we need to limit and redress the damage now. I suppose that's a short-term goal. And I think we need to seize the opportunities, as you've mentioned. That's more psychological and a little bit less semantic. But obviously the two have to be, deeply symbiotic. That's a parallel track.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. All right, let's do one last round. So I had a colleague right at the back there. Yeah. First, and then here, and then down here again. Yeah.
Thank you. Patricia Garcia Duran from the University of Barcelona. What would happen if Trump was to take out the US from the WTO? Would the European Union then be better prepared to take perhaps more leadership or even to play the Chinese card? Thank you.
Okay. And yes, please, yes, just there, that's right.
Thank you. Andrew Cotty from University College Cork in Ireland. Would the panelists agree that ultimately Europe, in terms of big picture geopolitics, Europe and America will find that they have more in common with one another than they do with other powers, in particular Russia and China, and that type of logic may ultimately underpin or sustain the transatlantic relationship? Thanks.
Okay, so some idea of the West is still resident, perhaps. Okay, and then just down here. Yeah. One more here, if we could. Can you take the mic to here? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Joris Larik from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Just maybe to push Nathalie, Tocci and Michael Smith a little bit in the sense of, is it now cyclical, or are we on the brink of something completely new here? Because it's like maybe Trump, Brexit, they're catalysts for this structural shift. But then I think, sometimes we heard earlier, we've been there before, sometimes it seems. Europeans get startled by some international crisis. The hour of Europe has come, and then it passes. And then there's interesting plans, headline, capability, goals, what have you, battle groups and the like. Now, 2 years after the global strategy, can we say, are there at least some signs that this time it's different? That things will be actually implemented and really lead to such a structural shift? Can we already see some signs of that now?
Okay, thanks very much, Christian. Okay, well, let's go. I'll go in reverse order this time. So perhaps I could start with you, Amelia. So we have three questions. WTO exit, what it might mean. We have the question about whether Europe and the US really do have more in common than they do with other powers, China, Russia, and so on. And then the question from Leiden: are there really signs? What are the kind of signs of a structural shift that we might say are harbingers of a different future?
Okay, well, there's lots of trade experts in the room, so I would certainly refer you to them. But as we know, I mean, Trump is famously impatient, and his tendency is definitely not to wait for a case to sort of wend its way through the WTO. And I think the threat at this point is simply to suggest that he's disenchanted with the structure, doesn't approve of the rules or the norms. And as we've seen, in fact, I think the US is now sitting on, and perhaps has made sure that there is not going to be an American judge on the appellate body, which actually will slow down the entire process. I don't think it's going to break it to pieces. Even if they do pull out, I mean, there are states that aren't part of the WTO. But as they're going to quickly find out, you're still going to have to trade on the basis of the WTO structure, to the best of my knowledge. So you still have to work within the established structures, now largely codified on and by the WTO. So it's rather like the UK with the European Union. You're still going to have to work within the prevailing structures, standards in terms of goods and latterly services as well. It would be a very stupid move, though.
Okay. Nathalie.
Yeah, so do we have more in common with one another than with the rest? I think ultimately the answer to that question will depend on whether and how, let's say how more than whether, both the United States and Europe in its different shapes and forms will exit this nationalist populist wave that we're undergoing at the moment. Because, and this is why I come back to the sort of gimmick story of a few moments ago. I mean, ultimately, if that kind of thing, which, you know, it will change with respect to what it is today, but it may have some lasting effects, will ultimately undermine that value base. Then there may be indeed be lots of similarities across the Atlantic, but they're not necessarily similarities that are going to entail a community of values, and certainly not joint action. So I still remain mildly optimistic, but I do think that the greatest challenge is not so much an external challenge about the Russians and the Chinese, but it's about more of an internal challenge. Mind you, I do see the connection between the two. You know, we've been used to, for instance, talking about soft power, our soft power vis-a-vis the rest. Well, yeah, particularly in the case of the United States, managed to exert it because it was powerful. Now, the point is, as other powers that do not do not share the same values are going up, they exert a certain magnetism vis-a-vis others, and they're exerting it towards us. So I think there is a link between the rise of, you know, the Chinas and the resurgence of the Russias, etc., and populism at home. And it is the soft power that is exerted upon us. Anyway, so I don't know, but I do remain mildly optimistic. On the question of, you know, whether this is something different. So, you know, can we say that the developments that have taken place, particularly in security and defence in Europe over the last couple of years, are really going to make the difference? I would say the jury is still out. I think, you know, there are lots of similarities so far between what has been happening now and the kind of developments that took place in the early 2000s, I would say. I think there's an interesting parallel that both started in very different ways as a means of reconciling Europeans internally, both the European security strategy and the security and defence developments that took place afterwards, the crisis management structures, the EDA, a number of other things, and the global strategy and the way in which it attempted to reconcile internal differences within the European Union, and the way in which that then led to a number of developments in security and defence. The difference between the two has again to do with the fact that back then no one really doubted that the United States would come to the rescue of Europeans. I think that is the difference between then and now. That today there is that doubt. And that doubt is, you know, sometimes we believe it, sometimes, you know, one day yes, one day no. So, you know, I don't know, as I said, how long it will take and whether we're going to succeed. What I'm absolutely 100% certain of, though, is that if we don't succeed, not only is the transatlantic relationship as we knew it over, because it's the United States itself that will change in its role in the world, but that we as Europeans are going to be completely overwhelmed by developments elsewhere in the world, because either we stick together, particularly on these issues, or there's no way that we can protect ourselves moving forward.
Thanks, Mike.
Right, yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add, but I would say a couple of things. Going to the point that you made earlier on, Nathalie, about the Europeans having to grow up in the context of possible American withdrawal and other challenges and so on. This is the first time that the word Brexit will have passed my lips. I'm afraid if the Europeans are growing up, in my purely personal view, the British are going in the other direction. in defence specifically. But connected to that is the fact that, going back to the NATO point as well, there will be no more committed member of NATO than a post-Brexit Britain. I could use the word desperate rather than committed. I think that whether that makes any difference or not is a totally unpredictable matter. But there will be no more desperate adherence to the idea of defence cooperation in a post-Brexit Britain. On the WTO, as Amelia said, it seems that the Trump strategy at the minute is to just deny it oxygen through the appellate body and so on, to destroy it by neglecting it or obstructing, not just American judges on the appellate body, but any. That is, part of perhaps potentially at least a more general American approach to international institutions and international rules. But there is a certain, what you might describe as the Wile E. Coyote approach to international institutions if this does happen, which is, you remember Wile E. Coyote is always in his pursuit of the roadrunner, running off cliffs and carrying on running, but then suddenly realizing that actually there's nothing holding you up. I think international institutions may suffer from a version of that if there is a real withdrawal of resources and powers and legitimacy from them. And that just doesn't apply to the WTO, it applies to others. And that raises the whole question of how much they're going to be sustained by the Europeans or by other means than simply American commitment. On the question that Andrew raised about the idea of the West, well, of course, that infringes on Nick's territory, actually, and the idea of the Anglosphere. That in some way there's a version of the West which is not transatlantic in the sense of European-American, but is connected to the Anglosphere. I'm deeply sceptical, and I don't know what Nick's position is on the Anglosphere, and on the way it enters into the British consciousness. It's a much more diverse and potentially troublesome concept than perhaps a superficial view might see it as. I don't think there is that kind of substitute. I think there's a role for Western values, but the question is, this is in a world of competing value systems where it's not just that there are new powers, so to speak, but there are new concepts of ruling values and reigning ideas, which are coming from not just China, but India and various other places. There's a reorganization or a reassembling of values in the international arena, and Western values have to take an appropriate position within that rather than an assumption that they are in some way automatically superior.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Mike. I should say I'm likewise sceptical of the idea of the Anglosphere, but it has been a powerful and important tradition in British politics over the last century or so, and therefore has to enter into our explanatory frameworks at some point. Right, I'm afraid we're out of time now, but can I thank our panel for their excellent contributions. I'm struck by how much is open and up to debate.